everyone, to another edition of the NACFON Australia podcast. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Mark Krikorian, who's the Executive Director of the Centre for Immigration Studies in Washington, D.C., and a nationally recognised expert on immigration issues in the United States. He has been published in all the leading broadsheets in the United States, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, and is a regular contributor to National Review Online. He's regularly asked to testify before Congress on immigration law reform, including last month. You were there, right, Mark?
Yep.
Yeah. I'll kick things off with obviously an issue that has gained a lot of attention in Australia recently because of the presidential debate. What exactly is going on in Springfield, Ohio?
Well, I'm open to evidence that people are eating cats and dogs, but I suspect that's one of these urban myths, or, somebody's cat got run over by a car and got lost. Anyway, that sort of thing. That's not the important issue. Now, The fact that Trump brought it up, and even before that, drew attention to the place. I don't know if you saw all of those memes about cats, Trump protecting the cats and the ducks and all. It was hilarious. But it did draw attention to the issue. The thing is, it doesn't matter whether they're eating cats or not. This modest-sized town has been overwhelmed by thousands of people who have arrived here, foreigners who've come in within literally just a couple of years. Many, if not most of them, actually admitted into the United States by this administration, even though they're inadmissible. They have no legal authority to let them in, and they just let them in anyway. And when you add on top of that, the fact that these are people from, a country with, let me put it this way, not entirely familiar with middle-class modes of behavior, you end up with a real culture clash, as well as demands on public services, problems with public order. It's not even, in other words, you don't have to eat cats to be a problem if people are, repairing their cars on blocks in the front yard and, stay and being loud at night and all of that sort of thing. That's not criminal, but it is the kind of disorder that people rightly object to. Now, if two Haitian families had moved to Springfield, Ohio, well, then nobody would care. But when thousands of people, literally within a few years, show up, that's just unacceptable. I mean, it doesn't matter even where they come from. It's unacceptable because for immigration to work well, it needs to be low and slow so that newcomers can, learn the ropes and understand how we expect them to behave. And they don't put pressure on housing, hospitals, public services, all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, the situation in Springfield, Ohio is not something we have really experienced in Australia. There was 20,000 predominantly Haitians have ended up there. How did that come to be? Are they asylum seekers? Did they come through across the border, or how did it work?
The administration has developed these programs where they just assume that people are seeking asylum, even if they're not. In other words, they're imputed to be asylum seekers. And some of them come across the border, turn themselves in, and get let in. But a much larger number are literally allowed to just fly into the United States after having gotten clearance via an app on the phone. And this administration paroles them in. This is parole in the old sense. There's also criminal justice parole, but in the old sense of the word, you are, the way it works in immigration is the executive has the right to let in people who have no right to be here. But it's a very narrow authority, and it's supposed to be for, important public good. I think that's the word, or, urgent humanitarian need. So in other words, if your appendix bursts and you're at the border, you can be paroled into the country to go and get medical treatment, and then they usher you back, and that's the end of it. Or if you're going to testify at a trial and you're a criminal, they couldn't give you a visa if they wanted to, but we need you to show up to testify at a trial. You can be paroled in. It's supposed to be for a handful of people. This administration in 3.5 years has paroled in more than 2 million people. And many of them are Haitians. There's actually a program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And the rationale is, well, these people would sneak across the border illegally otherwise. And so this is the humanitarian way to let them come here and make their asylum claim. Except they don't even ask them at the airport, okay, what's your asylum claim? They just kind of assume that that's what they want to do, and they let them go. And then at some point, a year, 2, 3, 4 years in the future, they're supposed to show up and make an asylum claim.
So these guys, these people that have they've jumped on a plane in Haiti and then head to the United States. And
not necessarily Haiti. Actually, we did research on this program, the one for Cuban, Haitian, Venezuelan, Nicaraguans. They come from they're flying in from 77 different countries. Some of them are coming from the country of their nationality. Others are in Fiji, Australia, Japan, and they're flying here. It's like, well, what humanitarian? You want asylum? You're already in a place where you should be asking for asylum. Now, I understand why I say Australia would encourage them to leave, but that's not our problem. And in fact, many of them, for the Haitians, many of them were already settled in Brazil and had lived there for many years, some as many as 10 years, because they left after the earthquake a while back in Haiti. They have legal status in Brazil. Their kids are born in Brazil. They have passports. It's just that they want to trade up to the United States because the Biden administration has opened the doors.
So I mean, Australia is very familiar with illegal immigration and asylum seeker claims, but we put in place in 2001 on a pretty much bipartisan basis. Now it's accepted this offshore processing regime,
right,
where
stop the boats program, basically, right?
Yeah. Well, the Pacific Solutions goes for a variety of different names. Where in Nauru, which is a place in the Pacific, and then Manus Island, people are sent there to come by boat. Now we have the advantage, obviously, we're surrounded by water. We don't share land with anyone else, so it makes it useful. But do you guys have any sort of offshore processing regime of that nature?
Under the Trump administration, the only thing we did like that was Remain in Mexico, was the shorthand name for it. And under that program, which is authorized by law, not specifically for Mexico, but something like that, offshore processing, basically, we sent certain people who snuck across the border, we sent them back across the border in Mexico to wait their asylum hearings there. And then when their turn came, we actually had facilities set up right at the border. And sometimes with video conferencing, they would have their hearing there. And if they succeeded, they'd be let go. Otherwise, they would be ushered back, 100 feet back to the border crossing and sent back into Mexico. The problem is Mexico has to agree to that. Well, first of all, we have to want to do it. This administration discontinued it literally on day one. But the other thing is Mexico has to agree. And getting Nauru or Papua New Guinea to agree is probably easier. They're smaller places. Australia's a smaller country, but they're way smaller. And so you have more, you can twist their arms or even, sort of bribe them more effectively. Mexico's a big country and we can pressure it, but the imbalance is not as enormous as it is between, say, you guys and Nauru. I mean, if, Nauru needs Nauru needs Australia a lot more than you need them, although there's a benefit to it. For us, our economies with Mexico is more intertwined than it's ever been. And they still need us more than we need them, but the imbalance is not like, say, Italy with Albania. They have a similar relationship now with Albania, where people wait their offshore processing. I actually think we need to take the idea beyond that to basically say, you're not even allowed to apply for asylum because you've passed through Mexico. You have no right to apply for asylum. Or even if you fly in, say you flew in from Charles de Gaulle or from Tokyo or something. Well, you should have applied for asylum there. You had plenty of chances. No one who makes it to the United States who isn't actually from Mexico, in my opinion, should be allowed even to apply. Now, that would require a change in law, and it would require something along the lines of what you're talking about. But it wouldn't be offshore processing. It would be more like what the relationship you guys had with Cambodia, where you don't even apply for asylum. Cambodia is willing to take you. Now, as I read recently, only 5 people took up Cambodia's offer, and 4 of them ended up going back to their own countries. So much for their need for asylum. I call this for us, this isn't, nobody's pushed this, but this is the kind of thing I'm trying to lay out. I call it remain in Mongolia. So if you come across the border, we find a friendly country or more than one, Mongolia. The British Foreign Office apparently found that Armenia was willing to take people if it was made worth their while, and just say, look, this is not offshore processing. You don't even get to apply. But if you're being persecuted in your home country, well, Ulaanbaatar is looking really great this time of year, and you're not going to be persecuted there. So have a nice day. And once you do that, you're going to see the numbers dry up. I mean, your numbers aren't that big once you instituted the Pacific solution.
Yeah, and they were never, although they were significant, there was a constant flow at the beginning, they did dramatically tail off. And numbers are everything, as you know, in immigration. Yep. What's your best estimate now for the numbers of illegal immigrants coming into the United States?
Well, I mean, the number who are here already is probably something like, probably something like 15 million, which is a significant increase. Under this administration, close to 7 million new people have come in. In other words, the net increase in the foreign-born population. So it's actually more than 7 million came because some people leave or die or what have you. More than half of those are illegal aliens. So this administration is responsible probably for the settlement of, let's say, round numbers, 5 to 6 million illegal aliens. That's lower than some other people say, because some of the statistics are encounters with illegals at the border, and sometimes it's the same person several times. So there's some double counting there. But I think it's safe to say probably 6, I would say even maybe 7 million illegal immigrants have settled here under this administration. They've either been let in affirmatively, in other words, taken into custody and released, or they are what's called known gotaways, where we actually have camera footage of them or blimps saw them or whatever, but they weren't taken into custody.
Yeah, it's hard for Australians to, I think, fully wrap their head around the scale of it.
Kind of hard for me, but yeah.
Yeah, and there are terms in the US which are routinely used and filter their way across here, which I don't think we quite get our heads around. I mean, one is sanctuary cities. That's just not something that exists in Australia. What is a sanctuary city, and how do they come about?
Well, you all have a federal system, but I guess our federal system is more federal. I don't know. But the fact is that the federal government can't impose its will in a lot of instances on local governments. And what a sanctuary city specifically means is that when an illegal immigrant or when anybody is arrested, their fingerprints are scanned and it goes to both the FBI and to Homeland Security now. That's like only in the past 10 years they actually completed the system for Homeland Security. So now Homeland Security knows almost every illegal alien who gets arrested because very often they overstayed a visa and they know that, or they were deported before and they shouldn't be here, that sort of thing. Homeland Security has the authority to say to the local jurisdiction, when you are finished with this person, with whatever you're going to do with them, let us know. Congress has given us authority to hold them for 48 hours after you're finished with them to give us a chance to get them. A sanctuary city says no and just lets them go. It's specifically intended to protect criminals. and there's no excuse for it, and it's difficult to deal with, though.
Is that because in the US, the local city is responsible for policing? Is that
Yes.
how they're able to do it essentially? So the police don't provide the information to the was it the Immigration and Nationalization Service?
Yeah, well, now it would be Immigration and Customs Enforcement are the ones who do that. ICE. Okay. But no, they don't have to provide. I mean, the fingerprint information goes automatically. There's nothing they can do about that. So ICE knows if someone in their database is arrested, and then they decide, do we have the resources to go get this person? When they send it's called a detainer. It's a notification. It's allowed in federal law saying, please hold on to this person. Sanctuary cities are free to let them go. The difference here, the twist is, cities are creations of state governments. That's the thing. And so states can ban sanctuary cities. They can say, no jurisdiction in this state is permitted to whatever. I mean, you can spell it out in a number of ways. And then they can follow that up. The feds can only, withhold certain funding programs, things like that. They can do some things to try to apply pressure, but they can't just say, no, you have to do this or we're going to come and arrest your mayor or whatever.
So what should be done and what likely will happen to sanctuary cities? Is there a way of?
Yeah, I mean, there's no clean way to just switch it off. The reason this is happening is because it's in big cities run by left-wing administrations, literally do not believe in the legitimacy of borders and immigration law. And so they simply refuse. They reject the legitimacy of immigration law, pure and simple. Deportation is illegitimate. It's all illegitimate in their view. Now, if you commit a crime, they might arrest you and send you to jail. But when you're done with that, these sanctuary jurisdictions see it as your right to be able to stay here after you finish your jail term, if that's what happens. And under Trump, there are some things they did try to do. They said there are certain Justice Department law enforcement funding programs. They said we're not going to give you the money if you do that. And some of the jurisdictions complied. Others said, the big ones said, we don't care. We'll live without the money because it's more important to us to release criminals into our communities than it is it's perverse, but the rationale, like I said, it's both in principle, but they also see it. The argument they make is that if we were to work in any way with immigration authorities, that would undermine trust in the immigrant community and they wouldn't come forward to report crimes to the police, that sort of thing, which actually we've done some research on this. It's total baloney. There's actually something called the Crime Victimization Survey, and it doesn't seem that there's any difference in reporting of crimes, whether you're in a sanctuary jurisdiction or not, but that's the rationale.
It strikes me that there's a different political culture, both on the right and left in the United States compared to Australia to a certain degree. Trump has changed that to a certain extent, but you still get mainstream Republican types who talk in a very romantic and in a way that Australian politicians simply would not. For example, I remember, Jeb Bush famously saying, illegal immigration is an act of love. You would not get a Prime Minister Tony Abbott or John Howard, the former leaders here in Australia, or even anyone on the left talking about immigration being an act of love. And you wouldn't get, the famous George W. Bush, family values don't stop at the Rio Grande, as if that was an excuse for sort of opening the border. You wouldn't get about people talk about, illegal, I don't know, if family values don't stop at the East Timor Sea or stuff. It just wouldn't. And it seems to me, at least, it goes back further, right? Because you can get YouTube videos where you see Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush talk about, in their primary in Texas, talk about how, we've got to be open-minded, and in response to a guy, questioning why illegal immigrants should be enrolled in public schools, them sort of just talking in very sort of flowery, open-ended terms, which again, I just don't think has ever. I mean, we have a immigration romanticism here in Australia, and it's a very kind of emotionally laden abstraction for some people, but it's just not quite the same. Why do you think that is on the right?
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, some of it is the crass part of it is that farmers and other employers have just gotten used to access to cheap labor.
Right.
I mean, that's not all there is to it. It never is, but that's a big part of it, honestly. Until 1986, it was explicitly lawful to employ illegal aliens. It was illegal to be an illegal alien, and you couldn't smuggle them or harbor them. But the law specifically said employment does not constitute harboring of illegal aliens. And that provision was called the Texas Proviso, not by accident, because ranchers and farmers wanted access to cheap, controllable labor. So in the Southwest, there's a certain, tradition of that, which you've never dealt with. But then as far as the ideology and the sentimentality, I think the civil rights revolution had a big part of that. I mean, you guys had a similar thing. You got rid of white Australia, but for us, I think it's just way more central, our experience between blacks and whites and slavery and all of that. Maybe I'm wrong here, but when we changed the immigration law in 1965, that was explicitly seen as part of the civil rights movement. In other words, because it wasn't quite white Australia, but we had national origins quotas that favored Northern Europe instead of Southern and Eastern Europe, that kind of thing. And so those national origins quotas were, discriminatory. And so it was seen as contrary to the civil rights kind of mood. The only other thing I can think of for the right in particular is that one of the other reasons the 1965 Act passed is because of the Cold War. And so I think that view is still sort of seen as we're the, mother of exiles and the asylum to the world, and people voting with their feet, against authoritarianism and voting for freedom, that kind of thing. So that's baked into, especially on the right. And that's why it makes it so much harder to kind of clarify this as a clear right versus left issue, and then have an election, and then who wins gets to make policy. Now we're moving away from that. I mean, the Cold War ended 30 years ago, for heaven's sake, but it's still there to some degree.
Yeah, I think I remember you saying in a video or something that there's still this Cold War mentality where when people say asylum, they automatically think Russian ballerinas sneaking across into the embassy, whereas that's not the reality today of the
not at all. I mean, asylum overall needs to be rethought. It's an anachronism. It's from World War II, beginning of the Cold War. Like you said, it's for you. It was seen as, and for a long time it really was, for a handful of Russian ballerinas. It's not what we're facing anymore, and for a whole bunch of reasons. Cold War is over. Transportation is now dramatically cheaper than it ever was. The European colonial empires no longer exist, so these countries no longer are necessarily linked to a different country. They're kind of more free agents now. And, there's no way, it's simply not sustainable. If anything, it's a bigger problem for the Europeans because, they're sitting on top of Africa, which is going to have 4 billion people at the end of the century. But it's a problem for all countries. We have a counterpart think tank. We have a network of immigration restrictionist think tanks, and we have a counterpart in Jerusalem. And they actually deal with a significant amount of African illegal immigration. And they use asylum there as the rationale to stay in the country.
Yeah. Are the think tanks in DC now focusing on this? Because I remember reading an article not long after Trump's victory in 2016 where R.R. Reno, who's the editor of First Things,
Rusty,
the guy, and he said this. He says it's really quite telling that places like AEI and Heritage, who are, as you know, big US think tanks don't have full-time staff working on immigration questions, when in fact it turns out to be the single most salient political issue in the West in the 21st century.
Yeah,
is that changing?
It's changed a little bit, some places, but it's very true that for a long time, every think tank, the big think tanks, even the center left and the center right ones, all would have a staff member that the communications director could direct a phone call to on immigration. But that's it. In other words, they had like a desk officer for immigration who could say a few, cliches and platitudes and get a quote in a newspaper story. But that's it. There was no actual work. Especially because of the disaster over the past 3 years, there's a lot of people now jumping on the bandwagon, our bandwagon. I mean, we've been there all along. The Heritage Foundation, for instance, now actually has, it's limited, but they do have several people now who actually do focus on immigration. And, one of them is a retired former Foreign Service guy, dealt with consular issues a lot. So, he's a serious person. So it is changing a little bit, but some of that change is more for the purposes of fundraising than actually producing output. In other words, you'll get a lot of organizations, sending out direct mail or email, fundraising requests saying, we're fighting to secure the border. And it's like, okay, they know that because people respond to that. There's a limit to how much actual work is getting done on this, but there is more than there used to be.
Yeah. Like I said, Australia, as you well know, has been quite successful at stopping illegal immigration, at least illegal immigration coming across via boat. Yeah. But legal immigration is another matter. The numbers are sort of quite extreme, really.
Yep.
You've argued for both a pause in illegal immigration, both legal and illegal. And you wrote an article in the New York Post a while back this year, which explained that we have in the past had, at least in the United States, a more or less a complete pause when the 1924 Immigration Act was passed there. Can you explain how that came to be and what the effect of that really was?
Sure. Immigration has always come in cycles. In other words, we had, for our size, relatively significant illegal immigration until the French and Indian War, which is what is that in Europe? The 7 Years' War in Europe. Actually, George Washington started the 7 Years' War in Europe, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Then until the Irish potato famine and the revolutions in Europe in 1848, there was very low immigration. Alexis de Tocqueville, who may not be familiar to listeners, but he's a French observer, toured America. He kind of wrote the authoritative look by a foreigner at what America was like. He was here in the 1830, I think, or 1830s. Never once mentioned the word immigration or immigrants. Never. It just never came up. And then we had, starting with 1848, about a lifetime's worth of pretty high immigration. Irish and Germans, later Scandinavian, later Italians and Jews and Eastern Europeans. And in 1924, that was finally not totally stopped, but the era of mass immigration ended then. The thing is that Congress had passed reductions in immigration a number of times, at least 3 times before that. It had gotten to the president's desk and it had been vetoed, really for reasons of, satisfying business concerns. And industrialists wanted to make sure they had more fodder for the factories. And finally, it was shut off because, first of all, the percentage of the population had gotten high enough. It was close to 15% of the population. And for us, especially considering how big the country is, that kind of triggered something, I think. But the other thing that did it was the Bolshevik Revolution and anarchism. In other words, there was enough industrialists, not all of them, but enough of them said, okay, I'll be willing to pay a nickel extra an hour if that will make sure I don't get killed in my bed in my sleep. It is that kind of thing. And so it passed. And for really almost 45, really almost 50 years, we had very low immigration. And, we had the booming, the roaring 20s, and then the Depression, and then the war, and then the expansion after World War II. All of that happened with, in the backdrop of immigration kind of being in the rear view mirror. It was part of our history. This is one of the reasons I think Reagan, and look, I'm a big Reagan fan, is the first person I ever voted for. I voted for his reelection by absentee ballot from inside the Soviet Union, where I was a student at the time. They didn't count the vote. But he grew up in a time when immigration was like the covered wagons crossing the plains, or the pilgrims landing in Plymouth. In other words, it was purely gauzy sentimentality. And so he kind of took that view with him, because that, you're shaped by really kind of when you grow up. And that's why he talked about, high walls, but wide gates, and all of that kind of malarkey. But the point is, we restarted mass immigration in the mid 60s, and it really didn't get going until 1970, I guess. And since then, we've had the biggest wave we've ever experienced. And we now not only larger number of immigrants, which you would expect because our population is bigger, but we now have a larger percentage of our population that's foreign born than has ever been recorded in American history.
What is that? Because I'm sure the Australian percentage is higher.
I'm sure yours is higher. I mean, we're a bigger country. It's in March, and this is an undercount, but we're using census data, 15.6%. And that's just the immigrants themselves, not children, native-born children. And so for us, I mean,
1 in 4 Australian residents are foreign.
No, that's and that doesn't surprise me. But for us, first of all, we're a much bigger country, so we'll actually be, if things continue as they are, it'll be close to 1 in 4 by 2040, which isn't that far from now. I just don't think that's going to happen here.
It won't happen because there will be
because I think the numbers are going to be brought down. Maybe not as much as I want them to be brought down, but I think it's politically unsustainable for them to continue like this.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I mean, I just don't think also that people on the right have truly understood the political ramifications of mass immigration as well, and how it's not only not a winning issue to be in favor of it, but long term it flips your state or flips your territory in favor. Because the much sainted Ronald Reagan, who I'm also a fan of, but he introduced an amnesty bill, right? Is it 1986 amnesty bill?
1986, yeah.
Yeah. Again, amnesty is not a concept that is used in political discourse in Australia. We just don't have to. It's not really an issue we talk about or deal with. But that flipped California, and no one has voted Republican in California, apart from the Arnold Schwarzenegger or sort of odd, sort of freak type of events, right? So do you think the Republican Party is a purely purely out of political motivations are getting that?
I think they are starting to get it now. Clearly, again, Trump helped kind of wake people up. And what's interesting is that in 2012, after Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama, when Barack Obama ran for re-election, Romney actually, despite his milquetoast reputation, and which is not entirely undeserved, he was actually relatively hawkish on immigration. And so the powers that be in the Republican establishment after that defeat issued a report on why the defeat happened. And a big part of it was, we're just too hard on immigration, too tough. And, we have to basically chase after the Democrats and, get the Hispanics to vote for us. Well, what's changed is that Trump's getting a bigger share of the Hispanic vote than any Republican ever at this point. I mean, the idea that Republicans had to be for mass immigration and loose enforcement and legalizing illegal aliens if they were going to survive politically has just been completely disproven by the facts. And see, what I think a lot of the Republican establishment didn't get, and the Democrats don't get this either, is that Hispanics aren't qualitatively different from Italian or Greek or Armenian immigrants anyway. In other words, there isn't even really a super strong, at least not a politically articulated ethnic identity. Yes, they have ethnic traditions and they eat certain foods and all that stuff, but there's no institutional network, or it's nothing. And they're all Christians. It's nothing like what Europe is facing with Islamic immigration. And so, they kind of want their kids to be Americans, and intermarriage is not really a problem. And so the reason I bring this up is that I think too much of the chattering classes have come to internalize this absurd racial classification system that we have in the law, where Hispanics are kind of considered a separate race sometimes, depending on how you talk, when, some of them are 100% Indian, some of them are, stepped off the boat from Spain. It's complete nonsense. And what we're seeing is Hispanics are just becoming, a sort of another kind of white-ish ethnic group. And they're voting, and it's not that they're all going to vote Republican, it's that they're going to vote more like the whole rest of the country, which means they'll vote more Republican than they had been voting in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a broad category, isn't it, Hispanic? And I don't even think we use it in the same way in Australia. If we use it at all, far less frequently than it seems to be used in the United States, right? Like Cubans and Chileans and Hondurans, and it'd be like talking about Asians in general. All that happens, but we
do that too. Asian, we talk about Asians in general, which is preposterous. I mean,
Vietnamese, and so it's crazy. I mean, what do you say to the pro-natalist right, who say, well, we need to have immigration, otherwise we'll end up like Japan. We may not like it, but that's the reality, and it keeps us young and dynamic. What's wrong with that?
Birth rates are declining everywhere in the world, except sub-Saharan Africa and Afghanistan. It seems to be. That's it. Well, to borrow something that Margaret Thatcher said years ago about socialism, if the only problem with using immigration to populate your country is eventually you run out of other people's people.
Yeah.
It's not, and long before you get to that point, you will have totally replaced your population. Now, this whole thing about, replacement theory, the left tries to make it into a boogeyman. No, there's no theory. George Soros and Hans, what's his name, in Switzerland aren't like dreaming up some plan to, replace America. It's just facts. If you have low fertility and high immigration, eventually you replace your population with somebody else. So, low birth rates can be a problem. I mean, there's no question about it. But immigration doesn't solve anything. All it does is enable you to ignore the problem and have other people populate your country. We have to grapple with why people are having fewer kids. Is it too expensive to form families? Declining religiosity is part of it. The expansion of the welfare state probably is part of it, because, you don't need to rely on family anymore. There's a lot of reasons. I don't have any 5-point plan on how to reverse low fertility. I'm just telling you that, I'm just telling you that migration is not a solution. It's just replacing your people with different people. And that's no solution at all. Our Constitution, the preamble of our Constitution is designed to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And if you don't have any posterity, well, you're importing somebody else's posterity. That's not what the function of the state is. So no, and it doesn't even work very well, because immigrants age 1 year at a time, just like everybody else. Their fertility, if it's higher than ours when they get here, usually falls pretty quickly. And we actually get a lot of immigration from very low fertility countries. Cuba's fertility is lower than ours. Iran is lower than ours. In fact, most of Latin America, with a few exceptions, have lower fertility, or at least a fertility that's below replacement. It may not be low. Mexico, for instance, huge country, their fertility is now at or below replacement, the 2.1 babies per woman. This is happening everywhere. We need to deal with it. Immigration is not a solution at all.
Yeah. I mean, what does the world look like in 20 years when this lack of babies, lack of people comes down the line?
I have no idea. 20 years is not, maybe like 40 years, you're going to see it more. Well, South Korea may not exist because they have the lowest fertility of any actual country. I mean, other than, Singapore or something like that. They have the lowest fertility in the world. Fewer than one child per woman. And I have no idea. One outcome that some people have discussed is that what happens is a bigger share of your population is made up of the kind of people who actually want to have kids. In other words, religiosity increases just because all of the secular people died off. That could happen. If you're Europe, that might be a real problem because there's more people going to mosque on, Friday in England and France than there are going to church on Sunday. This is a potentially a real problem. I think the United States and Australia, because we have distance from a lot of places, maybe are a little better off or a little better positioned to deal with it. Because, Indonesia isn't really your Mexico, but it's kind of similar. It's a huge country sort of next door.
Yeah.
Their fertility is, if not below replacement, it's getting there. So anyway, the point is that we're going to have to deal with it. I think the United States in particular is probably better suited to weather the problems than other places. I have no idea what Korea is going to do, or Germany. I don't know. I'm just glad I have our problems instead of their problems. That's kind of the way I think about it.
You got enough on your plate, I imagine.
Yeah.
Hey, one of the big issues in Australia, at least at the moment, is that in addition to the quite incredible numbers of legal migrants that we've had, is that our universities have now take unbelievably about 10% of the world's international students. That's
right.
So yeah, it's all very well to laud Australia and how good we've been on illegal immigration, but we make it up for it in other ways.
Right.
What's the situation in the United States? Do the universities try the same thing over there with giving students work rights and then a backdoor sort of route to? Universities as visa mills, basically. You come in, you do some sort of course, but your main motivation is to get citizenship or permanent residency.
Absolutely. It's a problem that is real, but only is now sort of little by little. We've been banging away at it for years, but only now is it getting to be recognized, I think. Now, there's different. We have real visa mills that are just genuine, that are really just fake schools. In other words, you may go to school for 2 hours on a weekend, and the whole point is you get the work permit, so you work the whole rest of the week or something like that. But even the regular, the sort of actual universities, New York University, for instance, which is a big school, is either number 1 or 2 in the percentage of foreign students, and it's like 25% of the entire student body. And it's a private institution, so in some sense, people say, well, they can do what they want. But even private institutions, as opposed to state schools, are still subsidized by the government. And I think we're moving toward a developing consensus that there needs to be a cap on foreign students, because there's no cap, and there's no percentage cap for any individual institution. Both of those things are going to have to happen. And I think one of the reasons people are increasingly open to it, only on the right, obviously, at this point, is because universities are so malignant and poison our culture so thoroughly that nobody really cares what they think anymore. And on the right, it's the unofficial motto of the right is academia delenda est. Senator Vance has said, we need to seize their endowments, like Henry VIII in England with the monastery. You know what I mean? So,
Oh, I've just lost your sound, Mark. Did you hit the button? Oh, let me just pause it for a second. Yeah. So no, it's a major problem with the universities in Australia. Sydney University, which is one of the more prestigious universities in Australia, it has 49% international students.
Wow.
And some have larger numbers, but as a percentage
Wow.
wise. There's nothing like that yet in the United States, right?
Well, there is, but they're not mainstream
Yeah,
real universities.
Ivy
Yeah.
League and
Yeah, no.
other,
They're just, I mean, there are places that are almost 100% foreign students, but they're
yeah,
just
right.
fly by night for profit institutions that are, certified by some equally fly by night, certification institutions that they're legitimate, educational institutions. But no, we're not that far gone yet. But interestingly enough, being a foreign student has now been tied into work in an even more tight way. And what I mean by that is not only can you work while you're a student, there's something called the Optional Practical Training Program, OPT, which is now, depending on how you measure it, maybe the biggest foreign worker program in the United States, because it allows foreign students who are no longer students, they've graduated, but they are allowed up to 3 years if they're studied in STEM fields, and up to 1 year if not in STEM fields, to just work basically on their student visa, kind of masquerade as students, but just work full time. And the whole point of that is to have a bridge between graduation and other work visas, something called the H-1B visa, especially for tech workers. So it has become, and it was simply made up by the George W. Bush administration. It has no basis in law. One of our fellows was involved in a lawsuit against it, and he lost because the court said he doesn't have standing to sue. In other words, doesn't have a genuine, genuine disagreement that he's directly involved in. You know what I mean? So anyway, but so yes, the universities have now become almost part of the tech industry's means of making an end run around congressional limits on immigration.
I mean, it is a new phenomena. In addition, the tech scene is interesting because it is a new phenomenon, this ability to provide labor remotely, valuable labor, which is new compared to the way the world worked in 1950 and the people industries. Do you have a position on that? Do you think the tech industry should be able to, in the US, should be able to engage remote programmers in India and Philippines?
Well, there's a limit to how, whether you can prohibit that or not.
Yeah.
But the fact is, there's a reason that they're not doing that already. I mean, or they are doing it, but there's a reason they're not doing it more, is because that kind of remote work is much more difficult. You're crossing time zones. It's a lot easier if you're 1 or 2 hours separate than if you're 8 or 10 or 12 hours, off sync with your coworkers. And what we find that often Indian companies that are contractors that contract out labor is that they will bring foreign workers here. The American workers who have those jobs are required to train them, and then the American workers are fired. And the Indian workers that now know how to do their jobs go back to India and work offshore there for 10% of the salary. I'm not sure how you can limit that in the sense that you don't allow the work visa aspect of it. I'm not sure how you prevent it. I mean, there's always been offshoring of work constantly. But my main issue is, if we are limiting the arrival of these foreign students who then become foreign workers, you slow that process and you make the tech firms use it where it works for them, rather than essentially subsidizing and accelerating that kind of offshoring, which we shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, right. Just I'm going to wrap it up because I know you're short on time. In general, I always find like immigration is such an odd issue because it's always dealt with, or tends to be dealt with, in a sort of very emotive, abstract way. People, you're either pro or anti-immigration, and no one talks about like you're either pro or against tax in those terms, or even like welfare policy. I mean, people can have more reasonable discussions about that. What have you found are the most persuasive arguments to break through that with politicians and the general public?
I think the argument that I think works best for people is something that makes them, I think it's correct, but it also makes them feel that they're not being bad people and disrespecting their grandparents. And the way I think about it is that the immigrants today really aren't that different from immigrants in the past. Yes, they're coming from different countries, but it's a similar kind of phenomenon. What's different is us. We now have a post-industrial knowledge-based economy. We have a welfare state. Advanced communications and transportation complicates the process of assimilation because you can live in two countries at the same time. Complicates security aspect of immigration because now, security threats can operate across long distances easily in the way that wasn't true in the past. All of that means that immigration today is different. In a modern society, mass immigration creates greater challenges than it did in the past. This isn't to say immigration wasn't challenging in the past. I mean, we especially tend to view this through rose-colored glasses. The Irish coming here in the 1840s and 50s, and everybody's all romantic about the old sod and all this. And frankly, there was a lot of drunken fighting and violence and killing and prostitution. It was terrible.
And also demographic change, right? I mean, I have Irish ancestry, and it sort of dawned on me the other day. Massachusetts used to be John Adams, highly, Protestant, whatever they were, and it got completely transformed.
Totally
and then
transformed.
Which is,
and honestly, Boston was not improved by the arrival of Irish. I'm from Boston, and I got nothing against the Irish, and it was 150 years ago, so who cares at this point? But it was a dirtier, more violent, more unruly place when the Irish arrived. There are pluses and minuses to everything, but it's not as though it was all some, gauzy experience from a movie. So anyway, my point is that all of that having been said, it's more difficult in a lot of ways nowadays because the changes in the economy and government, even our leadership classes' views on assimilation, for instance. 100 years ago, newcomers were expected to become American by everybody, whatever whether it's government, business, academic, religious leaders, they all kind of agreed, look, you're here, you got to become an American. Now it's nothing like that at all. Our leadership class is ambivalent at best about patriotism and assimilation. They don't even like to use the word assimilation, let alone Americanization. And so that is a fundamental difference and it's not the immigrants' fault. They didn't do it. They didn't do anything. They just showed up. But we need to rethink whether our immigration policy is sustainable in these new conditions. That's kind of the way I find that resonates with people because they don't have to feel bad about, their grandma because it's not about their grandma. Frankly, your grandma from Sicily came here with the same human capital. She might end up being on welfare too. You know what I mean? It's a different world than it was back then.
Yeah, no, I think that J.D. Vance has a lot of pithy lines, but that one about America being not just an idea, but a people with a shared history and a shared future is resonated, at least with me, and I think it is very foreign to that kind of open borders mindset that you find particularly in the American right, but both in the American right and left, which is changing. Hey, Mark, I'm not going to keep you any longer. If people want to find out more about you and your work, what's the best way for them to find you?
The Center for Immigration Studies is online at cis.org, and we have a blog there. We almost every day have new content. And if you're into snark and sarcasm, I'm on Twitter at Mark S, as in Stephen, Mark S. Krikorian.
Awesome. I'll look that one up for sure. Thanks again for your time, Mark. Really appreciate it, and go well. See ya.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
Bye.